Welcome to this edition of Author. I'm Joe Skelly. Get ready for a discussion of the female body that you probably never heard before. Get ready for what one female doctor calls liberation biology. Author Natalie Angier joins us this half hour with her national bestseller, Woman in Intimate Geography. Angier is a science writer for the New York Times, where she was awarded the Pulitzer-prize after only 1 year on the job. Prior to her work at the Times, she covered science news for Time magazine and was a staff writer for Discover. She earned a BA with high honors at Barnard College, studying literature, physics, and astronomy, and later studied journalism and news writing at the City University of New York and New York University. The author of The Beauty of the Beastly and Natural Obsessions, Angier has won numerous awards, including the American Association for the Advancement of Science Journalism. She lives in Tacoma Park, Maryland, with her husband, the science writer Rick Weiss, and their daughter. Natalie Angier, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Now, you write in the introduction that the book tackles the question, what makes a woman? And you try to do this through biology in a liberating and revolutionary way. Doesn't that mean, in a great sense, that you're taking on history and science and centuries-old thought about the body?
Right, exactly. So what I try to do is use anything at my disposal to understand the body. So I kind of take a tour of the body. It's a fantastic voyage, if you will. And it goes from the very small. I start out with a discussion of the egg, and then I move into the very large and end with a discussion of love. So I try to go sort of from the anatomy and physiology into the great stew of human emotions, and look at it from, yes, a historical, literary, and also biological and evolutionary perspective to kind of give you new insight into how the body works.
And of course, until more recent decades, for centuries, all the scientists and writers were men, for the most part.
Right.
So there's a lot of science and mythology that you, in some ways, have to combat.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because so many female body parts are named after male doctors, you know, sort of staking their claim there. Fallopian tubes, for example, or the glands of Montgomery, which are the little bumps around the nipple, are named after Dr. William Featherstone Montgomery. So yes, our bodies have been defined by male doctors and male scientists throughout the ages. But there's a lot of research being done now actually by female biologists, evolutionary biologists, who have spent their time looking at things from more of a female perspective. So I bring a lot of that into the book too.
Give us a sense of the historical then. What did they get right in the early centuries, and what were they totally wrong about?
You know, what's interesting is that early on, a lot of the early anatomists had a sense of how the male and female bodies were actually built from the same mold, that male and female parts are almost like interlocking parts, that they come from almost, one early researcher called the female body basically like the male body turned inside out. And they kind of had that right, that a fetus starts with potential to be either male or female, and then the parts are kind of sculpted away depending on what the final decision is, whether it's going to be male or female. You get rid of the male parts or you get rid of the female parts. So there is homology and analogy between male and femaleness that the early anatomists really understood. And perhaps later on, there was more of this idea that somehow they were completely different and unrelated. So there was a better understanding before that there was a lot in common. So I think they got that right. But early anatomists, for example, they couldn't actually do any work on human corpses. So they had to analogize from other species. So they came up with the idea that the uterus had like 7 horns or compartments to it, because that was what some other species you see. So there was a lot of misconception just based on what they couldn't do.
And of course, in more modern times, we do look at a lot of other species and the ones that are closest to us, and you've done that, you've written about it.
Right. I think that we can learn a lot about ourselves by doing a kind of a cross phylogeny. Just look at how all these different species solve problems. I think what we make a mistake is in looking at one species and saying, oh, this is how we can understand early humans by looking at chimpanzees. Well, that must say a lot about basic human nature. But in fact, Chimpanzees are very different from another related species called the bonobos, which have a very different way of carrying on, and yet they're equally related to us. So some of the early biologists made a mistake of saying, oh, we're just like chimpanzees, but in fact, we're probably also just like bonobos, and we're also like other species. And so we can avoid that pitfall if we look at a cross-section and say, how do all these different animals solve these problems? Maybe we can have insight into our own nature by looking broadly.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the, I don't know if it'll be surprising for some people or not, but you say that the female body is a template for the species.
Yeah,
Is this new thinking?
No, actually, there's a debate now about the degree to which the female is the default sex, that you'll become a female if you're not told to become a male, basically, by testosterone from the male testes. So the idea that it's kind of, like rolling a carpet down the hill, well, there goes a female, whereas the male is the complex one. And there's a lot of debate among developmental biologists if the female is truly the default, or if that's just a kind of a lazy way of looking at it, that in fact to make a female also requires active participation, not just something that will happen if you leave well enough alone. So they're looking for genes that actually help to develop things like the ovaries or the female genital tract. So there's been more sophisticated understanding. But what's interesting is one scientist who has this idea of the female as not the default sex, but the ancestral sex, and the male as the derived sex, so that the female is the kind of one that's been there all along, and males come and go, meaning that sometimes you can have asexual reproduction and sometimes you have sexual reproduction, but the female's always there whether it's asexual or sexual, and it's the male that kind of comes and goes throughout evolutionary time. So this man says, well, what this suggests to us is that since the male is the derived one, the male is more like the female than the female is like the male. So it's an interesting thing to play with, and I do in the book. I kind of take it humorously and say, well, is this why men are so afraid of being mistaken for female, and why you can put, a girl in, make her into looking boyish, and that's okay, but men are so afraid of the idea of putting on a skirt, for example. So is it just this fear of being sucked back into the ancestral female? So I kind of play around with that, but the way in which we think about sex, I think, can be informed by these new insights from biology.
Well, your first chapter, you deal with the egg. You call it unscrambling the egg. And the egg is a very unique cell, isn't it? It
is. It's the rarest cell. There are very few eggs in, well, obviously none in a man, but there's very few in a woman. It's, as I say, the rarest cell. It's one of the biggest cells. It is visible to the naked eye. Most cells are invisible. And it's also the only perfectly spherical cell. It's shaped like a pearl, or it looks actually like the sun. When you isolate it and look at it, it's perfectly spherical, and it has these coronas, these flanges coming out of it. So it actually looks a lot like a sun when you see it. It also has a lot of information in it. Besides for the genetic information, it seems to have information necessary for the very earliest stages of development. It's a very, I think, sophisticated cell, which is why perhaps, we can't make new ones throughout life. It's perhaps a little bit too complicated a cell to keep producing throughout life, and that may be why women are born with all the eggs they're ever going to have.
Which is amazing. I didn't know this until recently, not from reading your book, but just some months ago. And the fetus starts out with several million eggs?
They start dying off. They basically commit suicide through a mechanism called apoptosis, where they basically just, they just kind of disappear into the void. So they're created and then they disappear. And by the time a baby is born, there's maybe 400,000 left, and then they just keep disappearing after that. So there's a kind of a winnowing out and a selection process always going on, which is why I say that, what this implicates is that we're good eggs, every one of us. I mean, after all that winnowing out, we kind of come up with us, the good eggs. So there does seem to be a lot of selection going on throughout life for the best eggs.
You were talking a little bit about chromosomes. That's the subject of your second chapter, and you shared in the book that you remember your parents once having an argument about chromosomes.
Yeah, my father used to like to pick up on little tidbits and then make it into some kind of philosophical argument for male superiority, usually. So this argument was that because men have X and Y, whereas a woman has XX, that says that men are more complicated chromosomally and more interesting because the monotony of the XX is the female. And he sort of saw this as the genesis of superior male creativity. So my mother, who, God bless her, was able to see through this and said this, you know, I remember this terrible argument over something so silly, but it got me thinking, because I was a young girl, about this, and what actually turns out that the X chromosome is in fact not monotonous and not dull, but quite an interesting chromosome, and that in fact female XX, even though there are two same chromosomes, different, you get one from your dad, one from your mom, but different ones are turned on and off in every cell of your body, including your brain. So your brain is this kind of patchwork quilt of some X's from your dad, some from your mom. And what this means is, because the X chromosome plays a role in brain development, it's possible that some mental disorders have a more complex pattern in women, like it's been shown with certain types of epilepsy, that because of this interesting X chromosome patterning, it can be more complicated in a woman than in a man. Whether other mental diseases follow that same pattern, we don't know, but it does say that there's nothing boring about the X chromosome.
I think you pointed out too, the X chromosome is a lot bigger than the Y chromosome, so you said guys, size does matter, right?
Well, it has, you know, about 6,000 genes compared to about maybe 50 on the Y chromosome. The interesting thing is that because of this X patterning, men turn out to be more closely related to their mothers than to their fathers. And so, I mean, by, you know, about 6% closer. So that's an interesting difference.
If you just joined us, you're watching Author, and our guest today is Natalie Angier. Her new book is called Woman in Intimate Geography. What is the default line? This is chapter 3.
That was talking about the issue of whether or not the female is the default sex or the ancestral sex. So that was the idea of what does it mean to say that we are default. Can we come up with a better description for what the female body plan is? And you mentioned during an earlier conversation the nipples, and it is true that the nipples are remnants of the fact that men have nipples means that they have the capability early on of becoming female, so they have to be able to have breasts. However, the flip side, of course, is that a lot of people argue that the female clitoris is in fact a vestigial penis. So, you know, depending on what kind of perspective you want to take on it, whether you look at the, you know, male with the nipple and female with the clitoris.
And you say the clitoris might be a vestigial clitoris, or?
Well, whether or not it's the, you know, I compare it to the music of Bach because of this kind of perfection of it, but
it's very different than what a man has, right?
It is. I mean, the clitoris has no function other than sexual pleasure, whereas obviously the penis does. So it does seem to be an unusual organ in that sense, that has only one. Most organs actually have multiple functions. This one seems to only have one function, and it's the most nerve-dense tissue in the body. It's got just, you know, many times more nerves than the penis does, and so it's, you know, it's interesting anatomically and also evolutionarily. So to talk about it as a vestigial penis seems to me to kind of give it a limitation that it perhaps doesn't deserve. And I go into the arguments on the function of the clitoris, because there's a big debate. Evolutionary biologists love to debate things like why we have clitorises. And there's a debate over whether it's something that actually is adaptive or whether it's just there because you have to build a penis and this is our party favor. And I kind of go into the different arguments for and against.
One of the implications may be, too, that men are supposed to want sex more and enjoy it more.
Yes.
Whereas with the female organ, maybe they can actually enjoy sex more than men can.
Yeah, it's the evolutionary arguments that men are driven for greater sexual variety.
There's so much cultural programming, isn't there?
Right. It doesn't, to me, make sense that the clitoris operates the way it does with having capacity for, you know, basically almost an infinite number of orgasms in a given period of time compared to the male limitations. And to then turn around the argument and say, well, but men really are driven to seek sex more and with a greater number of partners, it kind of ignores some critical bits of anatomical evidence. So,
in all the studying you've done now over several years through college and now as a writer, how has your understanding of being a woman for yourself changed?
It's changed in the positive direction. I talk about it in one chapter where I remember having this conversation with my grandmother, my mother, me and a younger female cousin, and we were sitting around talking about whether we would want to be men if we could. And this was back about 12 years ago or so, and every one of us said yes. And I was surprised because my grandmother at that point, maybe she was in her late 70s, I was surprised to hear her say that too. And she said it's because they have more freedom. And everybody wanted to be a man. And I thought, well, this was kind of depressing. And I recently had the conversation again with my mother. My grandmother's dead, but I was talking to my mother, reminding her of it. And I said, do you still feel that way? And she said, no. And I said, I don't either, that somehow my understanding of the female body and the evolution of my own thinking has made me appreciate it to the degree where I don't feel that it is a disadvantage. And I'm glad I have a daughter, and so I think she's got a lot of freedoms ahead of her that perhaps maybe boys don't have as much.
You've got a chapter on the uterus, and you say it's the only part of the female body with no anatomical equivalent in men.
That's right. It doesn't have a, you know, I mean, the clitoris has the penis and, you know, the labia and scrotum. So there's anatomical homology except for the uterus. The uterus is an amazing organ. It grows and shrinks to a degree that no other, I mean, by 1,000-fold without bursting apart. I mean, if you did that to the liver, well, you couldn't. So it would kill you. So the uterus has the capacity to grow to a tremendous degree, and then within just a little while after giving birth, it's all tidily shrunk back again. I mean, it's controlled so exquisitely. It's an amazing organ, I think underappreciated, evidenced by the fact that it's cut out so easily in hysterectomies, the second most popular operation in America. So I think that we're just beginning to understand some of the sophistication of that organ.
You've got 3 or 4 chapters on hormones. Very important.
I think hormones are the bridge between sort of body and behavior. So I kind of use it as the bridge to understanding how the body and the brain kind of talk to each other and affect each other. That hormones are one of the kind of the messengers, and they hold information, vital information, and convey that back and forth. It's a two-way system.
And did I read right, there are hundreds of different types of estrogens? Is that right?
Well, I mean, we don't know yet. We're actually still finding new estrogens, and also estrogen receptors. That was a big discovery recently, that there's more than one way that the body actually detects estrogen. It was thought that there was just one way through, you know, estrogen receptor. Now it turns out there's at least 2 and possibly more. So that sort of says that there's a lot of very delicate modulation going on. And estrogen is an amazing hormone generally. It seems to affect every part of the body. It used to be thought of as just a sex hormone. And now it turns out that every part of the body is actually affected by it. So I think that, you know, it says something again about perhaps this ancestral state, that a hormone associated with female sexual development is something that influences the whole body, including in men.
And you have some interesting things to say about aggression in women.
I think aggression, it's one of these subjects that keeps coming down to, oh, of course men are more aggressive than women. Well, women know that's not true, because women know how aggressive we are towards each other. And I talk about starting in girlhood. I mean, we really have to fight it out amongst ourselves to establish a hierarchy, to know where we are in the sort of the primates order. And I really try to get women to think about their own aggressiveness. Female aggression, there's different types of aggression. There's physical aggression, there's verbal and sort of facial aggression, and then there's the indirect aggression, which is the backstabbing, the trying to get away with it without having to pay the consequences. And those three types of aggression, depending on your cultural circumstances, you're going to express your aggression somehow, and it's either going to be in that kind of Linda Tripp backstabbing way, or if you're allowed to express it more directly, that might be the preferred route. So I say, well, we may just call women less aggressive because we don't really define aggression properly. And in cultures where women are supposed to be submissive, you see them engaging in a lot more of this indirect, backstabbing, gossipy aggression. So it's going to come out, you know, it's going to poke up here or there, but it's going to come out. And we're mammals. Mammals are aggressive.
Well, you write about revolutionary psychology, liberation biology. You're trying to get people to think differently. You've gotten praise across the board from many different publications, from men and from women. If there's one thing that maybe people are critical of your book, what would that be?
Well, two things. One, evolutionary psychologists they claim that I caricature them. I don't really think I do or can. I wish I could, because I think a lot of it is silly, and I think it could be a lot better as a science. And if it's becoming better, and I think recently there's been a lot more open debate about it, that's only to the good of science. So if by caricaturing it, I help to clarify what some of the weak spots are, that's only going to be to the good of it.
And when you say evolutionary psychology,
that's the kind of one type of neo-Darwinism that's popular now, which specifically talks about male-female differences in ways that I think are too narrowly defined.
These aren't maybe natural scientists or biologists?
A lot of them come from a psychology background but have kind of become evolutionary, and I consider myself a Darwinist too. I also think that actually feminism is an expression of an ancient evolutionary impulse on the part of females to have a certain degree of autonomy and integrity. And I don't think of it as something that's outside of science. I think that an expression of feminism is in keeping with a lot of good evolutionary thinking. And in fact, there's a lot of women in the sciences now who call themselves feminist evolutionary biologists. And it's not necessarily unscientific, it's just giving it a different spin.
Just a little bit of time left. What is essential for women and men to know about your book?
That it's not that I actually believe in joy, and that in understanding the body, it brings joy to everybody. So I also don't think of women as superior or inferior, and it's a mistake to think of it as a zero-sum game. If women feel better about themselves, that's not necessarily bad for men. And I think that actually sex only gets better when women feel better about themselves. So I don't see it as necessarily a war. I see it as a celebration.
And you're not really taking on that war in this book?
No.
I don't think.
No, you know, a lot of times it's inevitable that somebody says, oh, you're writing a book that's positive about women, you must be a man-hater. But someone even asked my husband, is she a man-hater? You know, because it's a book that's really sort of positive about women. And that's kind of, as I say, the zero-sum thinking people fall into. It's like either or. I think that women can actually feel better and more celebratory about their own biology without it necessarily being bad for men.
We want to thank Natalie Angier for being here. The new book is called Woman, An Intimate Geography, and you mentioned that you do end the book talking about love. What can biology teach us about love?
that love is so profoundly a part of being human, that we are perhaps the most loving species there ever has been, and that every one of our senses and our mind, our cognition, our memory, all feed into our attachments with one another. So that's one thing I go into in some detail, is that our circuitry is sort of designed not just for competition, but for this enormous affiliation. And when you understand all the ways in which your senses feed into that attachment, it's actually kind of beautiful. So I try to talk about it even in terms of loving our infants. And one of the things I suggest for men is that they have more skin-to-skin contact with infants that women do naturally because of breastfeeding, and men perhaps don't do as much. But that touch and skin-to-skin contact and this kind of whole-body experience is what feeds all the circuitries of attachment. So I think it's amazing how an understanding of biology, I think, can lead you to certain behaviors that enhance that.
Natalie Angier, thank you very much.
Thank you.